The town square in Millbrook went quiet by 9 most weeknights. The shops along Main Street dark behind their pulled gates, the only real light coming from the single street lamp at the corner of 4th, and the soft amber glow spilling from the front windows of the diner that closed at 10. The memorial stood at the center of the square, the way it had stood since 1979, a tall slab of gray granite mounted on a low brick platform, 4 names carved into its face, beneath a single inscription that most residents of Millbrook could recite from memory without ever having stopped to read it carefully, the way you stop noticing the furniture of a place you pass every single day of your life. Tyler Voss had passed that memorial probably 10,000 times in his 15 years, and could not, if pressed, have named a single one of the 4 men carved into it. This fact did not strike him as significant on the Friday night in October when he found himself standing in front of it with 3 other boys at 11 minutes past 11, because almost nothing about that night had struck him as significant, until it was already too late for the noticing to matter. It had started the way these things usually started, with very little at all. Connor Beckett had a can of spray paint he had taken from his older brother's garage. Jace Holloway had the idea, delivered the way Jace delivered most of his ideas, casually, as though it had only just occurred to him and was not, in fact, something he had clearly been turning over for at least an hour beforehand. The third boy, Marcus Stiles, said almost nothing the entire walk to the square, which Tyler would later understand as its own kind of agreement, the silence of someone who wanted to be talked into something so that afterward he could tell himself he had never actually agreed. Tyler said no the first time Jace suggested it. He said it again, less firmly, the second time. By the third time, standing under the street lamp at the corner of 4th with the can of spray paint already shaking loose in Connor's hand, Tyler had stopped saying no entirely. Not because he had changed his mind about whether it was a bad idea, but because the specific terror of being the one who ruined the night, the one who made the other 3 look at him a certain way, had become, in that particular moment, more immediate and more frightening to his 15-year-old nervous system than the actual wrongness of what they were about to do. This was the part Tyler would spend a great deal of time afterward trying to understand about himself. The way an idea he knew was wrong could simply get smaller and smaller in his mind, crowded out by something as stupid and as temporary as not wanting 3 other boys to think less of him for 30 seconds. They crossed the square at a half-run, low and fast, the way boys move when they have convinced themselves that moving carefully is the same thing as moving correctly. Jace went first, scrambling up onto the low brick platform, getting both hands on the top edge of the granite slab and rocking it experimentally, testing whether it would actually move before he committed to anything further. It rocked more easily than any of them expected, the decades-old mounting bolts having weakened with time in a way nobody walking past the memorial every day would ever have guessed simply from looking at it. Marcus joined him on the platform without a word. Connor stood back with the spray paint can, shaking it harder now, the small metal ball inside rattling loud enough in the quiet square that Tyler flinched at the sound of it. Tyler himself stood at the edge of the platform, not climbing up, not quite participating, telling himself in the specific dishonest way of someone trying to preserve some private fiction about his own innocence that simply standing there did not make him part of what was happening, a fiction that would not survive even one full day of honest reflection afterward. Jace and Marcus rocked the slab together on a count of 3, the granite groaning against its weakened bolts, and on the second attempt, it came free entirely, toppling forward off the brick platform and striking the pavement below with a crack that seemed, in the dead quiet of the square at 11 at night, considerably louder than any of them had braced for. It did not shatter. Granite that thick and that old did not shatter easily. But it cracked along one corner where it struck the curb, a long, pale fracture line running diagonally across the lower right section of the slab, directly through the carved letters of a name that none of the 4 boys had bothered to read before they knocked it down. Connor moved fast after that, the spray paint already hissing before the granite had finished settling on the pavement, dragging wide, careless lines of fluorescent orange across the inscription and the names both. Not words exactly, nothing that meant anything beyond the simple desire to mark something. The specific, senseless vandalism of teenagers who had stopped thinking about the actual object in front of them the moment it became a thing they had already broken, rather than a thing they were still deciding whether to break. Tyler stood at the edge of the platform the entire time, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, watching Connor spray paint over a name carved by a stonecutter 46 years earlier for a young man who had died at 22 years old in a place none of these 4 boys could have located on a map. And some small, clear, unwelcome part of Tyler's mind understood, even in that moment, even with adrenaline making everything feel slightly unreal and slightly far away, that what was happening in front of him was not a prank in any sense that the word usually carried. It felt, even as it was happening, like something that could not be taken back. The specific, dawning horror of an action that exists permanently the instant it is finished, regardless of how quickly the 4 of them might run from it afterward. They ran from it within 90 seconds. Connor dropped the spray paint can on the pavement beside the toppled slab without thinking to take it with him, a detail that would matter considerably more than any of them yet understood. The 4 of them scattered across the square and down a side street, laughing in the specific, high, unsteady way of boys whose bodies are processing fear as something close to excitement, not because anything about what had just happened was actually funny, but because laughing was easier in that particular moment than feeling the thing that was actually sitting underneath it. Tyler ran the longest stretch of any of them, peeling off from the other 3 at the corner of Maple and continuing alone the remaining 6 blocks toward home. And somewhere around the 4th block, his lungs burning and his legs slowing without his permission, the laughter that had carried him out of the square evaporated completely and was replaced by something heavier and considerably more durable, a feeling that sat in his chest the rest of that night and refused to leave even after he was home, even after he had changed out of his jacket and gotten into bed, and lain there in the dark staring at his own ceiling for what felt like hours. What none of the 4 boys knew, running away from the square in different directions at 11:14 on a Friday night in October, was that the house directly across from the memorial belonged to a woman named Sandra Whitfield, who had installed a doorbell camera the previous spring after a string of minor package thefts in the neighborhood. A camera with a wide-angle lens and infrared capability that had captured, in clear and uninterrupted detail, every single second of what had just happened in the square. It had captured Jace and Marcus climbing onto the platform. It had captured the slab toppling and cracking against the curb. It had captured Connor's spray paint, the specific orange color and the careless dragging motion of his arm across the granite face. And it had captured, with particular and unforgiving clarity given how close he stood to the street lamp the entire time, Tyler Voss, standing at the edge of the platform with his hands in his jacket pockets, not climbing, not spraying, but present and visible and unmistakably there for every single second of it. A fact that would matter to exactly nobody in the days immediately following, and would matter enormously in a way none of the 4 boys could have predicted in the months that followed after that. Sandra Whitfield discovered the toppled memorial when she stepped out onto her front porch at 6:15 the following morning to bring in her newspaper, the way she had done every morning for the past 11 years, and stood there for a long moment in her robe with the paper still rolled and forgotten in her hand, looking at the gray slab lying flat across the pavement of the town square, with the streetlight still washing pale over its orange spray-painted face. She did not immediately understand what she was looking at. Her mind, still slow with sleep, processed the scene as something closer to an accident, a delivery truck perhaps, before the actual shape and meaning of it arranged itself into focus, and she felt something cold drop through her chest. She went back inside and called the police before she had even put on real shoes. By 8 in the morning, the square had become the center of a kind of slow-motion gathering, the specific, quiet, accumulating shock of a small town discovering that something has happened to it overnight. People walking to work stopped and stood at the edge of the police tape that Chief Ortiz's 2 on-duty officers had strung between the lampposts, saying very little, most of them simply looking, the way people look at something that has not yet fully become real to them. A few took photographs on their phones, not out of any particular intention, simply the reflexive documentation of a generation that records first and processes second. Daniel Marsh heard about it from his neighbor at 7:40, a brief phone call that gave him almost no detail beyond the fact that the war memorial had been knocked over sometime during the night, and he was in his truck and driving toward the square within 4 minutes of hanging up, still in the flannel shirt he had slept in, not stopping to change because changing felt, in that particular moment, like it would cost him something he could not spare. He parked badly, half on the curb, and walked across the grass toward the gathered crowd with the specific, controlled urgency of a man who has trained himself across decades not to run toward things, even when every part of him wants to. He ducked under the tape without acknowledging the young officer who told him he should not be doing that, and stood over the fallen slab, looking down at it, at the long, pale fracture running diagonally through the lower right section, directly through a name he had known by heart for 54 years. Corporal James Earl Whitlock, 18 years old when he shipped out, 22 when he did not come home. The closest friend Daniel Marsh had ever had in his entire life, before or since. The orange spray paint ran in a wide, careless arc directly across the W in Whitlock, obscuring most of the letter entirely, and Daniel stood looking at that obscured letter for what felt, to the 2 officers watching him, like a very long time, though it was in fact closer to 10 seconds. His right hand came up without his deciding to move it, and his 2 middle fingers touched briefly to his own collarbone. An old gesture, decades old, the specific unconscious habit of a man who had once worn dog tags against that exact spot for 13 months in a country 8,000 miles from Millbrook, and who still, 54 years later, reached for them sometimes without remembering they were no longer there. Walt Ferris arrived 11 minutes after Daniel, having heard about it from the same neighbor's call chain that had reached half the chapter by then, and found Daniel still standing over the slab, not speaking, his jaw set in the specific particular way that Walt had learned across 40 years of friendship to recognize as something considerably more dangerous than ordinary anger. Walt did not say anything immediately either. He simply stood beside Daniel, looking down at the same broken granite, the same obscured name, and after a long moment, he reached into his back pocket for his wallet, opened it to the worn photograph he had carried there for longer than either of them cared to calculate exactly, and looked at it, without showing it to Daniel. 4 young men standing together in front of a transport bus in 1970. James Whitlock, second from the left, grinning at whoever held the camera in a way that none of them, looking at that photograph now, could ever quite reconcile with a name carved permanently into broken stone. He put the wallet back, without saying anything about it. Daniel had not asked to see it. Some things between the 2 of them had never required asking. Chief Ortiz arrived shortly after, moving through the gathered crowd with the tired efficiency of a man who had handled property damage calls for 22 years and understood already, before he had even fully assessed the scene, that this particular instance was going to require considerably more delicacy than the usual graffiti report. He crouched beside the slab, examined the fracture, examined the careless orange spray paint, and noted, with the specific professional attention of someone whose job depended on noticing such things, the spray paint can lying abandoned on the pavement 6 feet away, still partially full, a detail that was going to make identifying at least one of the responsible parties considerably easier than these cases usually allowed. He stood and looked at the small crowd gathered along the tape, at Daniel Marsh standing motionless over the broken slab, with his fingers still resting against his own collarbone, at Walt Ferris beside him, with his wallet only just returned to his back pocket. And he understood, with the specific, weary recognition of a man who had policed this particular community long enough to know its specific sensitivities, that whatever came next was going to involve considerably more than a standard vandalism report, and that the Iron Cross chapter, several of whose own members had names of friends carved into that exact memorial, was very likely about to become a great deal more involved in this case than Ortiz's normal procedures generally allowed for. He was right about that, though he could not have anticipated standing in the square that Saturday morning with the cold October light falling across the broken granite, exactly how involved Daniel Marsh was already deciding to become, or how unconventional the request was going to be that Daniel intended to bring to him before the day was finished. Daniel did not stay at the square much past 9. He had seen enough, and the longer he stood there looking at the obscured letters of his friend's name, the more he felt something hardening into shape inside him that was not quite anger, not in the simple sense of the word, but something closer to a clear and specific decision forming, the way decisions sometimes form, not through deliberate reasoning, but through a kind of settling, the mind arriving somewhere it has perhaps already decided to go before the reasoning even fully catches up. He drove home, showered, dressed properly this time, and called Walt before he had even finished tying his boots, telling him he wanted to go to the police station that afternoon. Not to file a complaint, which the responding officers had already done on the chapter's behalf without being asked, but to make a specific and unusual request of Chief Ortiz directly, one that Daniel had not fully worked out the exact wording of yet, but understood with the same settled clarity he had felt standing over the broken slab, exactly the shape of what he intended to ask for. Walt asked him what he meant. Daniel told him he wanted 48 hours before anyone filed charges, time enough to find out who had actually done this, and to propose something to them that the courts were never going to think of on their own, something that would require the boys responsible to actually understand what they had broken, rather than simply paying a fine and walking away from it unchanged, the way these cases usually resolved. Walt was quiet on the line for a long moment, and then he told Daniel that he was coming with him to the station, because if Daniel was going to ask Ray Ortiz for something this unusual, he was going to need a second voice in the room who carried just as much history with that memorial as Daniel did. And Daniel, hearing the offer, felt something in his chest ease very slightly for the first time since 6:15 that morning. The specific relief of a man who had decided to do something difficult and had just discovered he was not, after all, going to have to do it entirely alone. Chief Ortiz's office sat at the back of the Millbrook police station, a small room with a single window looking out onto the parking lot and a desk cluttered with the specific accumulated paperwork of a department that had 4 full-time officers covering a town of 11,000 people. He was on the phone with the county forensics unit about the spray paint can when Daniel and Walt arrived just past 2 in the afternoon, and he held up one finger through the glass of his office door, finishing the call before waving them in. He had known Daniel Marsh for the better part of 15 years, had known him well enough to recognize, the moment Daniel sat down across the desk without being invited to, that this was not going to be an ordinary conversation about an ordinary case. Daniel had a particular stillness about him in serious moments, a stillness that Ortiz had encountered exactly twice before in their long acquaintance. Once when Daniel's wife had been hospitalized, and once when a younger chapter member had died in a highway accident. And seeing that same stillness now, over what was on its face a case of teenage vandalism, told Ortiz before Daniel said a single word that this conversation was carrying considerably more weight than the property damage report alone would suggest. Daniel told him directly what he wanted. 48 hours. No charges filed in that window, not against whoever the security footage eventually identified, in exchange for which Daniel and the chapter would identify the boys responsible themselves, working faster and with considerably more local knowledge than the department's limited resources could manage on their own, and would then propose to those boys and their families a specific alternative to the standard legal process, one that Daniel was prepared to design and personally oversee. Ortiz sat back in his chair and looked at Daniel for a long moment without responding immediately, the specific patient skepticism of a man who had been asked for a great many unusual favors across 22 years of policing this particular town, and had learned that most of them, however well-intentioned, did not survive contact with the actual practical difficulties of carrying them out. He asked Daniel what exactly this alternative was supposed to look like. Daniel told him, honestly, that he did not have every detail worked out yet, that the specifics were going to depend on who the boys turned out to be and what their actual circumstances were, but that the core of it was simple enough to state plainly: restitution that required understanding rather than restitution that simply required payment or a handful of supervised hours. The boys actually restoring the memorial themselves, by hand, over a period of months rather than a single weekend, working alongside chapter members who had personal history with what had been damaged. Ortiz asked the obvious question, the one Daniel had been expecting since before he sat down. What happened if the boys simply refused to cooperate, or cooperated badly, or the whole arrangement collapsed after a few weeks once everyone's initial guilt and goodwill had worn off? Daniel told him that if it failed, Ortiz would still have every legal option available to him that he had now. The 48-hour window only delayed formal charges. It did not waive them. And if the restitution arrangement broke down at any point, Ortiz was free to step back in immediately and proceed however the department normally proceeded. This was the detail that eventually moved Ortiz more than anything in Daniel's actual argument: the specific structure of the request, which cost the department almost nothing to grant, and which Daniel himself stood to lose considerably more than Ortiz if it failed, since Daniel was the one proposing to spend months of his own time on 4 teenagers who had vandalized something deeply personal to him, with no guarantee whatsoever that any of them would respond to it the way he hoped. Walt spoke for the first time then, quietly, telling Ortiz that he understood the chief's hesitation, that he would have felt the same hesitation himself in Ortiz's position, but that he wanted Ortiz to understand exactly why this mattered enough to Daniel and to the rest of the chapter to ask for something this unusual. He told him, without going into the full story, that 3 names on that memorial belonged to men who had been close personal friends to several members still living in this town, that the chapter had quietly maintained and cared for that memorial for 46 years without ever once asking the town for recognition of it, and that what had happened the previous night was not simply property damage to the chapter. It was an injury to something they had spent decades treating as sacred, and that Daniel's proposal came from a genuine belief, born out of considerable personal experience, that real accountability looked less like punishment and more like forced understanding, and that he was asking Ortiz to give that belief a chance to prove itself before the legal system's usual process, fines and a handful of supervised cleanup hours, foreclosed on the possibility entirely. Ortiz looked between the two of them for a long moment, his fingers tapping once against the desk. And then he told them, with the specific, weary honesty of a man who had decided to grant something he still half expected to regret, that he would give them their 48 hours, on 3 conditions that he was not willing to negotiate. First, that he reviewed and approved whatever specific arrangement Daniel eventually proposed to the boys and their families before it began, rather than simply trusting Daniel's word for what it would involve. Second, that if at any point Daniel determined a particular boy was not actually engaging with the process in good faith, that boy would be handed immediately back to the department for standard charges. No extended grace period, no second chances beyond what Daniel himself judged reasonable. And third, that Ortiz himself would be checking in periodically throughout the process, unannounced, to see for himself how it was actually progressing rather than simply taking Daniel's reports at face value. Daniel agreed to all 3 conditions without hesitation, and Ortiz, watching the speed of that agreement, felt something shift slightly in his own assessment of the situation. The specific recognition that a man who agreed that quickly and that completely to being checked on and second-guessed was either entirely confident in what he was proposing or entirely unaware of how difficult it was actually going to be. And Ortiz, not yet certain which of those 2 possibilities he was looking at, decided privately that he was going to find out for himself rather than guess. They shook hands across the desk, an oddly formal gesture for the 3 of them, given how many years they had known each other in passing around this small town, and Daniel and Walt left the station with considerably less time than they had hoped to identify the boys responsible, since the doorbell camera footage Ortiz had already obtained from Sandra Whitfield earlier that morning would need to be reviewed and the boys identified before the 48-hour window expired, which meant Daniel spent the remainder of that Saturday afternoon at the station watching grainy footage on the laptop screen alongside one of Ortiz's officers, picking out 4 shapes moving through the dark square, recognizing none of them by face in the poor light, but understanding, by the time the footage ended, that whoever these 4 boys turned out to be, the youngest one, the one who never climbed onto the platform, who stood at the edge with his hands in his pockets the entire time, was the one Daniel found himself watching most closely on the screen, for reasons he could not yet fully articulate. Something in the specific stillness of that boy's posture that struck Daniel as different from the other. 3. Though he would not understand exactly what that difference meant until considerably later in the process he had just spent the afternoon fighting to make possible. The footage identified all 4 boys by Sunday evening, the local high school's yearbook photographs making the matching straightforward once Ortiz's officer had isolated clear enough frames to work with. And by Monday morning, Daniel had names, addresses, and a 48-hour window that had already burned through most of its first day. He decided against calling ahead. He wanted to see each family's first reaction in person, unfiltered by whatever a phone call might give them time to prepare. He went to the Voss house first, a modest single story on Birch Street, arriving just after 4 in the afternoon, when he knew from the school schedule that Tyler would already be home. Margaret Voss answered the door, still in her hospital records clerk uniform, having come straight home from her shift, and her face moved through several stages of confusion and then alarm as Daniel introduced himself and explained, as plainly and as gently as he could manage, why he was standing on her porch. She did not invite him in immediately. She stood in the doorway with one hand braced against the frame and asked him to repeat what he had just said, and when he repeated it, slower this time, the same essential information, that her son Tyler had been identified from doorbell camera footage at the scene of the vandalized war memorial Friday night. Margaret's face went through something Daniel had seen many times across many doorsteps over the years. The specific collapse of a parent's careful assumptions about who their child actually was. She called Tyler down from his room. He came down the stairs slowly, already reading something in his mother's posture, and in the presence of a stranger in their doorway that told him, before anyone said a word, exactly what this was about. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom and stood there, his hand finding the cuff of his jacket sleeve and beginning the nervous picking motion that Daniel would come to recognize over the following months as Tyler's most reliable tell. Daniel introduced himself again for Tyler's benefit and told him directly, without preamble, that the footage was clear, that Tyler had been identified, and that he was there to talk about what happened next. He watched Tyler's face carefully as he said this, looking for the specific things he had learned to look for across decades of dealing with young men in trouble. Defiance, deflection, the reflexive search for an excuse, and found none of them. What he found instead was something closer to relief, the strange and specific relief of a boy who had spent the entire weekend waiting in dread for exactly this moment to arrive, and had found the waiting itself almost worse than the consequence. Margaret asked, her voice tight, whether this meant her son was being arrested. Daniel told her no, not today, and explained, as clearly as he could, the unusual arrangement he had negotiated with Chief Ortiz, the 48-hour window, the alternative to standard charges that he was proposing instead. Restitution work alongside chapter members rather than a single supervised cleanup or a fine paid and forgotten. He told her this would mean months rather than weeks, Saturday mornings specifically, hands-on restoration work that Tyler would actually be taught to do properly rather than simply assigned as busy work, and that the goal was not punishment in the conventional sense, but genuine understanding of what had been damaged and why it mattered. Margaret listened to all of this with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and when Daniel finished, she asked him the question that Daniel had been expecting from at least one parent across the 4 households he intended to visit that evening. Why the chapter was proposing this instead of simply letting the police handle it the normal way. Fines, community service hours logged and forgotten, the standard machinery of minor juvenile offenses that this town, like most towns, had processed many times before without anyone needing to get personally involved the way Daniel clearly intended to. Daniel answered her honestly, the same answer he had given Chief Ortiz the day before, that he had watched the standard process produce paid fines and logged hours, and very little actual change in young people, more times than he cared to count across the years, and that he had a personal and specific reason for wanting something different this particular time, that the memorial Tyler and his friends had damaged carried the name of a man who had been Daniel's closest friend in the world, before that man died at 22 years old in a war most of the boys involved could probably not place on a map, and that Daniel was not interested in Tyler simply feeling bad and paying a fine for a few weeks before moving on with his life unchanged. He wanted Tyler and the other 3 boys to actually understand, by the end of this, exactly what they had broken, and he believed, based on considerable experience with young people across many years, that understanding required slow and difficult work, rather than a quick and convenient punishment. He told her plainly that this was entirely her choice and Tyler's, that he was not the police, he had no authority to force anything, and that if they preferred the standard legal process, Daniel would respect that and step back immediately. The formal charges would simply proceed once the 48-hour window closed. But he wanted her to understand what the alternative actually involved before she decided. Margaret looked at Tyler, who had come the rest of the way down the stairs and was standing beside her now, still picking at his jacket cuff, his eyes on the floor rather than on Daniel. She asked him quietly what he wanted to do. Tyler did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice came out smaller than Daniel expected from a boy his size, and he said that he wanted to do whatever actually fixed it, not just whatever made the trouble go away fastest, a sentence that Daniel would think back on many times over the coming months as the first genuine sign that this particular boy was reachable in a way the standard process would likely never have discovered. Margaret agreed on the spot, with visible reluctance about the unconventional nature of it, but clear relief that something other than a courtroom was being offered. And Daniel left the Voss house feeling, for the first time since Saturday morning, something close to cautious hope. The remaining 3 visits that evening went considerably less smoothly. Connor Beckett's father, a contractor named Greg Beckett, met Daniel on the porch with his arms crossed and his jaw set, insisting his son had been led into this by the other boys and should face minimal consequence, a position that softened only slightly once Daniel explained the alternative being offered and the specific consequence of the formal legal process Connor would otherwise be facing, given that the spray paint can recovered at the scene was registered, through the Beckett family's hardware store account, directly to Connor's own household. Jace Holloway's mother agreed to the arrangement quickly and without much resistance, distracted by other matters in a way that struck Daniel as its own kind of warning sign worth watching closely. Marcus Stiles's family proved the most resistant of the 4, his father flatly stating that he did not want his son spending his Saturdays with a motorcycle club, regardless of what the alternative to that arrangement looked like, a position that would eventually, weeks into the process, prove to be the household where the entire arrangement broke down first. Daniel drove home that Monday night with all 4 families nominally agreed to the arrangement, Chief Ortiz's 48-hour window closing the following afternoon with formal sign-offs still needing to be finalized, and he sat in his truck outside his own house for a long while before going inside, turning over in his mind the 4 very different reactions he had just witnessed. Margaret Voss's careful, frightened agreement, Tyler's small and unexpectedly serious answer about wanting to actually fix it rather than simply make the trouble disappear. And Daniel understood, sitting there in the dark, that whatever came next across the following months was very likely going to look completely different for each of these 4 boys, and that the boy he had found himself most curious about on the grainy security footage 2 days earlier, the one who never climbed onto the platform, was very possibly going to turn out to be the one this entire unusual experiment was actually capable of reaching. The first Saturday arrived gray and cold, the kind of October morning that made the square feel smaller and more exposed than it had felt on the warmer afternoons of the previous month, and all 4 boys showed up at 8 in the morning exactly as instructed. None of them early, none of them more than a minute or 2 late. The specific, careful punctuality of teenagers who understand they are being evaluated even before anything has officially begun. Daniel had expected, based on considerable past experience with young people facing consequence for the first time, that the boys would arrive braced for something closer to hard labor, shoveling or hauling, or some form of physically demanding busy work designed primarily to be unpleasant. And he had decided, in the days leading up to that first Saturday, that beginning with exactly the opposite of that expectation was important. He met them at the square with 2 other chapter members, Walt among them, and a single folding table holding nothing more dramatic than 4 pairs of work gloves, 4 soft bristled brushes, and 4 buckets of warm water mixed with a mild cleaning solution specifically formulated for granite. He told them, standing in front of the toppled and spray-painted slab which had not yet been lifted back onto its platform, that their first task, and likely their task for several Saturdays to come, was simply to begin cleaning the orange paint from the granite surface, by hand, with the brushes provided. No power tools, no shortcuts. Because the granite itself was old and somewhat fragile along the existing fracture, and because Daniel wanted them, before anything else happened, to spend real time with their hands directly on the surface they had damaged. Connor asked, with a note of genuine confusion rather than defiance, why they could not simply use a pressure washer, which would clearly do the job considerably faster. Daniel told him that faster was not the point, that this was not a project being measured by how quickly it concluded, and Connor, receiving this answer with visible frustration, picked up his brush anyway and knelt down at the edge of the slab without further argument. The first small test of the morning passing without the rebellion Daniel had half expected. Jace worked beside Connor with a kind of performative diligence that Daniel recognized immediately as a young man trying very hard to look cooperative without actually being particularly engaged, scrubbing in wide, showy motions that accomplished considerably less than the effort suggested. Marcus worked in near total silence, his jaw tight, his movements stiff and resentful in a way that suggested, even on this first morning, that his father's flat opposition to the entire arrangement had already shaped how Marcus himself intended to approach it. Tyler knelt at the far end of the slab, near the corner where the fracture ran diagonally through the carved letters, and began working the brush against the orange paint with a careful, almost cautious attention that none of the other three boys displayed, his strokes slow and deliberate rather than wide and hurried, and Daniel, watching from a few feet away while pretending to check the supply of cleaning solution, found himself noticing the specific care in Tyler's movements, the way the boy seemed to be paying genuine attention to the actual texture of the stone under his hands, rather than simply performing the motion of cleaning it. They worked for nearly 3 hours that first morning, the orange paint coming away slowly, stubbornly, the cold making the work considerably less pleasant than it might have been on a warmer day. And Daniel and the 2 other chapter members worked alongside the boys rather than simply supervising from a distance, kneeling at their own sections of the slab, scrubbing in the same slow, careful motions Daniel was hoping the boys would eventually absorb by example rather than by instruction. Almost nobody spoke during those 3 hours beyond the occasional practical exchange about cleaning solution or brush technique, and the near silence of it seemed to weigh on Connor and Jace considerably more than it weighed on Tyler, both of the older boys filling the quiet periodically with small comments about how cold it was or how long this was going to take, comments that Daniel let pass without responding to, understanding that engaging with the complaints would only encourage more of them. It was nearly 11, the boys' 3 hours almost complete, when Tyler finally spoke, his voice quiet enough that Daniel, working a few feet away, almost missed it entirely. He asked, without looking up from the section of granite in front of him, why they were doing this instead of just paying someone to come fix it properly. A contractor or a stone restoration company, someone who presumably knew what they were doing considerably better than 4 teenagers with soft bristled brushes and a handful of bikers who, as far as Tyler could tell, were not actually professional stone restorers either. Daniel set down his own brush and sat back on his heels for a moment before answering, taking the question seriously rather than brushing past it the way he might have brushed past one of Connor's complaints. He told Tyler that they could absolutely pay someone to do this properly and considerably faster, and that the chapter had in fact discussed exactly that option among themselves before deciding against it. He told him that the point was never really about the fastest or most efficient way to repair the granite. The granite, he said, was always going to get fixed one way or another, with or without the 4 boys' involvement. The point was what happened to the 4 boys in the process of fixing it. Whether they walked away from this having paid a fine and forgotten the entire incident within a year, or whether they walked away from it actually understanding, in some durable and lasting way, exactly what they had damaged and why a small town like Millbrook had cared enough about 4 names on a piece of granite to keep that memorial standing and maintained for 46 years. Tyler considered this for a long moment, his brush motionless against the stone, and then he asked in the same quiet voice whether Daniel had known any of the men whose names were on the memorial. Daniel told him yes, one of them, the closest friend he had ever had, and watched something shift across Tyler's face at that answer. The specific particular discomfort of a boy realizing for the first time, in a fully concrete and personal rather than abstract way, that the thing he had helped damage was not simply a piece of public property, but something that belonged, in the most real sense, to an actual, living person standing 3 feet away from him. Tyler did not ask anything further that morning. He went back to scrubbing the stone, his strokes, if anything, more careful than before, and Daniel watched him for a moment longer before returning to his own section, understanding that something small but genuine had just happened in that brief exchange. The first thread of a connection that Daniel suspected, watching this particular 15-year-old work in careful silence against the cold gray stone, was very possibly going to prove considerably stronger than anything the standard legal process would ever have managed to produce. The 4 boys left at 11:30 exactly, Connor and Jace moving quickly toward the parking area the moment Daniel told them they were finished for the day, Marcus following a few steps behind without a word to anyone, and Tyler lingering a moment longer than the others, looking back once at the partially cleaned slab before he turned and walked toward his mother's waiting car. And Daniel, watching him go, found himself already looking forward with a degree of genuine interest he had not expected to feel at the start of this difficult and uncertain process, to whatever the following Saturday was going to bring. By the 3rd Saturday in November, the orange spray paint had been almost entirely worked free from the granite, leaving behind only the faintest ghost of discoloration along certain pores in the stone that Walt explained would likely fade further with weather and time, but would never disappear completely, a fact he delivered to the 4 boys without softening it, the specific permanence of what they had done made plain rather than smoothed over for their comfort. The slab itself remained on the ground that morning, not yet remounted, since Daniel had decided the boys should understand the structural side of the repair before any lifting equipment arrived. And so the 4 of them spent that particular Saturday milling around the fracture line itself, learning under Walt's careful instruction how a stone restoration epoxy worked, how it had to be mixed in precise small batches, applied slowly along the crack, and allowed to cure for exactly the right amount of time before any weight could safely return to the repaired section. Connor and Jace treated the epoxy work with slightly more genuine interest than they had shown the simple scrubbing weeks earlier, the technical specificity of mixing ratios and cure times apparently appealing to something in both boys that mere cleaning had not, and Daniel noted this shift without commenting on it, understanding that engagement could arrive through different doors for different people, and that the goal was not to insist on a single uniform path toward understanding. Marcus worked that morning with the same closed-off silence he had maintained every Saturday since the first, his movements technically competent, but entirely without the curiosity the other 3 boys were beginning, in their different ways, to show. And Daniel had already begun to notice, with a degree of concern he had not yet voiced aloud to anyone, that Marcus's father had started picking him up exactly at the end of each session rather than ever coming inside the square itself, a small detail that suggested the resistance Daniel had encountered in that household during the first visit had not softened at all in the intervening weeks. Tyler worked beside Walt that particular morning, the 2 of them having fallen into something like a natural pairing over the previous several Saturdays, Walt's patient and detailed teaching style matching well against Tyler's careful, attentive questions. And it was during a brief pause in the epoxy application, while they waited for a small test batch to begin curing, that Walt reached for his wallet for an entirely unrelated reason, intending only to check whether he had remembered to bring cash for the coffee he planned to buy at the diner afterward, and in doing so, accidentally exposed the worn photograph tucked behind his driver's license, the edge of it catching Tyler's eye before Walt had even fully opened the wallet. Tyler asked, with the simple, unguarded curiosity of a teenager rather than any particular suspicion, what the photograph was. Walt hesitated for a moment, his thumb resting against the photograph's worn edge, and then, deciding something Daniel would later understand had been building in Walt's mind across the previous several weeks of watching this particular boy work, he pulled it free and held it out for Tyler to take. 4 young men stood in the photograph in front of an army transport bus, dressed in fatigues that looked too large on at least 2 of them, all 4 grinning at whoever held the camera, with the specific, careless confidence of young men who had not yet learned what the following months were going to cost them. Walt pointed to each one in turn. The man on the far left, he said, was James Whitlock, the name carved into the section of the memorial that the spray paint had covered most heavily. The same man Daniel had described weeks earlier as his closest friend in the world. 22 years old when he died, 18 in this particular photograph, taken the week before all 4 of them shipped out. He pointed to the second man, a name Tyler now recognized from the granite itself, having spent 3 full Saturdays scrubbing paint away from those exact letters. He pointed to the third, another name from the memorial. And then he pointed to the fourth man, standing at the far right of the photograph, younger looking than the others somehow, despite being roughly the same age, and told Tyler that this fourth man had come home, had lived to be 71 years old, had a wife and 2 grown children and 4 grandchildren, and was, in fact, the same man currently kneeling in the cold grass beside him, holding a worn photograph that he had carried in his wallet for 55 years. Tyler looked up from the photograph to Walt's actual face and then back down at the photograph again. The specific, disorienting recognition of seeing a person's entire decades-long life compressed suddenly into the gap between one image and the present moment, and he asked, quietly, what had happened to the other 3, the 3 whose names were on the memorial? And Walt told him, briefly, factually, without elaborating beyond what felt necessary, the specific circumstances of each death, none of them dramatic in the way movies sometimes made such things dramatic. Simply young men in a war that had asked enormous things of very ordinary people and had not always given anything back in return. Tyler sat with the photograph for a long moment after Walt finished speaking, his thumb tracing, almost without realizing he was doing it, the edge of the image, the same way Walt himself had been doing seconds earlier. And then he asked if he could go look at the names on the memorial again. Not to clean them this time, simply to read them properly, the way he had never actually done across 3 full Saturdays of scrubbing paint off letters he had not once stopped to actually absorb as names belonging to specific people. Walt walked with him the short distance to where the slab still lay on the ground, the epoxy curing in its careful small batches along the fracture, and the 2 of them knelt together at the edge of the stone while Tyler read each of the 4 names slowly, his lips moving slightly the way a much younger child reads, sounding out something that mattered considerably more than the simple act of reading usually required. James Earl Whitlock. The second name. The third name. And then his own eyes drifting to the 4th space on the granite, the space that held no name at all, because the 4th man in the photograph had come home, had grown old, was kneeling beside him right now in the cold November grass holding a photograph that suddenly meant something entirely different to Tyler than it had meant 10 minutes earlier. He looked up at Walt and asked him, in a voice that had lost almost all of its earlier carefulness and had instead taken on something closer to genuine distress, whether Walt had been angry, seeing the memorial knocked down and spray-painted, knowing what those names actually meant to him personally, rather than as abstract history. Walt considered the question seriously before answering, the same careful honesty he brought to most things, and told Tyler that, yes, he had been angry, briefly, standing over the broken slab the morning after, but that the anger had given way fairly quickly to something else, a kind of tired sadness more than rage, the specific weariness of a man who had spent 55 years watching the world periodically forget things that he himself could never forget, no matter how badly. On certain difficult days, he might have wished he could. Tyler did not say anything else for a long while after that. He simply knelt beside the slab, looking at the 4 names, the photograph still held carefully in his own hands rather than returned to Walt. And Daniel, watching this entire exchange unfold from a short distance away where he had been mixing a fresh batch of epoxy, understood that something significant had just shifted in this particular boy. Something that no amount of scrubbing or lecturing or supervised hours could have produced nearly as effectively as one old photograph and one honest conversation. And he found himself thinking, watching Tyler's careful, absorbed stillness, that whatever this entire difficult and uncertain experiment was eventually going to produce across the months ahead, it had just, on this particular cold Saturday morning, produced something real. December brought the cold in earnest, the Saturday sessions shortening slightly to accommodate the early dark and the genuine difficulty of working with stone and epoxy in temperatures that made even gloved hands stiff within the hour. And across those colder weeks, the four boys' separate paths through the process began to diverge from each other in ways that had only been faintly visible during the milder weeks of October and November. Connor Beckett had settled, by the second week of December, into something Daniel recognized as genuine, if somewhat surface-level cooperation. The boy showing up reliably, working competently, asking occasional practical questions about the restoration techniques without ever quite crossing into the deeper engagement Tyler had shown weeks earlier. Daniel suspected, watching Connor work, that the boy's primary motivation remained avoiding the formal legal consequence rather than any real transformation in how he understood what he had done. But he also recognized that competent, reliable cooperation, even without deep transformation, was still considerably more than the standard process usually produced, and he chose not to push harder than the situation required. Jace Holloway's path proved more complicated. He had grown noticeably quieter across the weeks, his earlier performative diligence fading into something closer to genuine, if reluctant, effort. And Daniel learned through a brief conversation with Jace's mother during a pickup one Saturday that the boy had been struggling considerably at home in ways that predated the vandalism entirely, his parents in the middle of a difficult separation that Jace had not mentioned to anyone in the chapter, and that Daniel suspected had played at least some role in the impulsive decision-making of that October night. Daniel adjusted his approach with Jace accordingly, asking fewer direct questions and instead simply working alongside him in a steady, undemanding presence that seemed, by the middle of December, to be having a quietly stabilizing effect that had little to do with the memorial itself and everything to do with a teenager who needed, for reasons unrelated to granite or spray paint, an adult who showed up reliably and asked nothing complicated of him. Marcus Stiles's path collapsed entirely in the third week of December. He had grown progressively more withdrawn and resistant across the preceding weeks, his father's flat opposition to the entire arrangement apparently hardening rather than softening with time. And on the Saturday before Christmas, Marcus simply did not show up at all. No call, no explanation. His father later informing Daniel by phone, in a tone that left no real room for negotiation, that he had decided his son would be better served by simply accepting whatever consequence the police department determined was appropriate, rather than continuing with what he described as an arrangement he had never fully trusted in the first place. Daniel called Chief Ortiz the following Monday and reported the development exactly as the agreement required, without argument or attempt to salvage the situation beyond what was reasonable, understanding that Marcus's father had every right to make this decision, and that pushing further would only confirm the man's worst suspicions about outside interference in his household. Marcus's case proceeded through the standard juvenile process from that point forward: a fine, a handful of supervised community service hours unrelated to the memorial itself, the kind of resolution that closed the file efficiently without producing, as far as Daniel could observe from a distance after that point, any particular change in how the boy understood what he had done. Daniel found this outcome genuinely sad rather than frustrating. a confirmation of exactly the gap he had argued to Ortiz existed between standard process and real understanding. But he also recognized it as a necessary and honest demonstration that the arrangement carried real consequences for failing to engage, exactly the structural integrity that had made Ortiz willing to grant it in the first place. Tyler's path, against this backdrop of one boy's quiet stabilization and another's outright collapse, accelerated in a direction that surprised even Daniel, who had begun by mid-December to suspect this particular outcome was possible, but had not expected it to develop quite so quickly or so completely. He began arriving early, sometimes by 20 minutes or more, helping Daniel and Walt set up the work table and the day's supplies before the other boys even arrived. A small, unrequested gesture that nobody had asked of him, and that Daniel chose not to comment on directly, understanding that drawing attention to it risked making Tyler self-conscious about something that seemed to be emerging naturally rather than performed for anyone's benefit. He began asking increasingly specific technical questions about the restoration work itself, the precise chemistry of the epoxy, the history of the original stonecutter's technique, questions that went well beyond what the assigned restitution required, and that suggested a genuine and developing interest in the craft itself, rather than simply the obligation attached to it. Daniel began teaching him more advanced techniques in response, brass polishing first, since the memorial's small dedication plaque had grown dull and tarnished across decades of weather exposure, the work requiring a patience and precision that Tyler, Daniel discovered, possessed in genuinely unusual measure for a boy his age. Tyler spent an entire Saturday in mid-December on the plaque alone, working in small, careful circular motions exactly as Daniel had shown him, refusing to consider the work finished until the brass caught the weak winter light in a way that satisfied some internal standard Tyler himself seemed to be holding, rather than any standard Daniel had explicitly set for him. It was during that same Saturday, working alongside Tyler on the plaque, while Connor and Jace handled a separate section of the granite base nearby, that Chief Ortiz arrived at the square unannounced, exactly as his original conditions had allowed him to do, parking his cruiser at the edge of the lot and walking across the cold grass with his hands in his coat pockets, observing the scene for several minutes before approaching anyone directly. He watched Tyler work the polish into the brass plaque with the same careful, absorbed attention Daniel had grown accustomed to seeing across the preceding weeks. And he watched Connor and Jace working competently, if somewhat less intensely, nearby. And when he finally approached Daniel, standing a short distance away to give the boys room to continue their work uninterrupted, Ortiz asked him, with the specific guarded curiosity of a man genuinely surprised by what he was observing, how things had actually been going. Daniel told him honestly, including the difficult news about Marcus, the file already formally transferred back to the department exactly as agreed. And Ortiz nodded at this, unsurprised, having half expected at least one of the 4 boys' households to resist the arrangement from the start. But when Daniel described Tyler's progress specifically, the early arrivals, the technical questions, the entire unprompted Saturday spent perfecting a single small brass plaque, Ortiz looked back across the square at the boy in question, still working with quiet concentration, apparently unaware that the police chief himself was now discussing him from 30 feet away. And Ortiz was quiet for a long moment before admitting, in a tone considerably less skeptical than the one he had used in his office back in October, that this was not, in fact, what he had expected to find on this particular unannounced visit, and that he intended to keep watching, but that what he was watching right now did look, to his admittedly experienced eye, like something genuinely different from the usual outcomes his department's standard process tended to produce. Chief Ortiz's unannounced visits became a regular, if irregular, feature of the following weeks, never on a predictable schedule, sometimes arriving early in a session, sometimes only for the final 20 minutes before the boys left for the day, And each time, he found essentially the same pattern Daniel had described to him in December. Connor and Jace working with steady, competent effort. Tyler working with a focus and craftsmanship that continued to develop well beyond what the restitution requirement alone would have demanded of him. By late January, Ortiz had stopped pretending, even to himself, that these visits served any real investigative purpose. He had become, in the specific way that surprised him more than anyone, genuinely curious about how this particular experiment was unfolding. And he found himself, on one cold visit in the final week of January, sitting on an overturned crate near the work table for the better part of an hour, talking with Daniel in a low voice while the boys worked nearby, the conversation drifting well beyond the specifics of the case into the kind of broader exchange two men who had known each other professionally for years, but never particularly closely, were only now, somewhat unexpectedly, beginning to have. Ortiz admitted to Daniel during that particular conversation that he had granted the original 48-hour request expecting it to fail within a month, not because he doubted Daniel's sincerity, but because he had simply seen too many well-intentioned alternative arrangements collapse under the actual weight of teenage attention spans and parental impatience to expect a genuinely different outcome this time. He told Daniel that Marcus's withdrawal in December had, if anything, briefly confirmed his original skepticism, and that he had half expected Connor or Jace to follow Marcus's example before the winter was over. What he had not expected, he admitted, watching Tyler work a careful bead of fresh mortar along a small remaining section of the granite base that afternoon, was to find a 15-year-old boy who had, by every observable measure Ortiz's experienced eye could identify, developed something considerably more durable than mere compliance. He told Daniel that in 22 years of policing this town, he had handled dozens of juvenile vandalism cases, watched dozens of teenagers complete their court-ordered hours and fines, and walk away from it with what Ortiz privately suspected was very little lasting change in how they understood what they had done, and that whatever was happening to this particular boy on this particular cold Saturday afternoon looked to him like something his own department's entire process had never once managed to produce in over 2 decades of trying. Daniel told him, with the same honesty he had brought to every conversation about this arrangement from the very beginning, that he did not believe what was happening with Tyler was something Daniel himself had engineered through any particular skill or strategy. He believed, rather, that this particular boy had simply been reachable in a way the other 3 were not, for reasons that likely had as much to do with Tyler's own character and circumstances as with anything the chapter had specifically done, and that the real value of the arrangement, in Daniel's view, was less about guaranteeing this outcome for every boy, and more about simply creating the conditions under which a boy like Tyler had the chance to be reached at all, a chance the standard fine and forgotten hours process would never have given him. Ortiz sat with this for a long moment, watching Tyler finish the mortar bead with the same careful patience he had shown weeks earlier on the brass plaque. And then he told Daniel something Daniel had not expected to hear from him, that he intended to mention this case, without identifying the boys specifically, to the county juvenile court administrator at their next regional meeting, not as a formal proposal for changing how such cases were generally handled, since Ortiz remained genuinely uncertain whether this particular outcome could be reliably replicated across different cases and different chapters and different boys, but simply as an observation worth raising, a documented instance where an unconventional alternative had produced something the standard process had not, and that this observation deserved at least the conversation, even if it never became formal policy. Margaret Voss noticed the changes in Tyler at home across roughly the same period that Ortiz was noticing them at the square, though from a considerably more intimate vantage point. She mentioned it to Daniel directly during a brief conversation at the end of a late January Saturday, while Tyler was helping Walt load the last of the day's supplies back into Walt's truck a short distance away. She told Daniel that Tyler had started doing his homework without being asked, a change so unusual in her experience of her own son that she had initially assumed something else entirely was wrong, before gradually realizing, across several weeks of observation, that it appeared to be connected directly to whatever was happening on these Saturday mornings. She told him that Tyler had also started talking at dinner in a way he had not done in years. Not about the restitution work specifically at first, but about history more broadly, having apparently checked out 2 library books about the specific war the memorial commemorated, without anyone suggesting he do so, and that he had recently asked her, somewhat shyly, whether she thought it would be possible for him to visit the County Veterans Archive sometime to look up more detailed records about the 4 men whose names were carved into the granite he had spent months now restoring by hand. Daniel told her honestly that he had not anticipated this particular depth of engagement when he first proposed the arrangement back in October, that he had hoped for understanding, but had not necessarily expected genuine intellectual curiosity to develop alongside it. And Margaret, watching her son help Walt secure a tarp over the truck bed a short distance away, told Daniel that she had spent the previous 3 months deeply mortified by what her son had done, had assumed, when Daniel first appeared on her porch in October, that whatever came next was simply going to be a harder version of the same shame and consequence she had braced herself for, and that she had not expected, in any version of how she imagined this unfolding, to end up grateful, genuinely and specifically grateful, to the very people whose memorial her son had helped destroy. By the first week of February, the structural and cosmetic restoration of the memorial was, by Daniel and Walt's combined professional assessment, essentially complete. The fracture had been repaired and reinforced from beneath in a way that would prevent any future weakening of the original mounting bolts. The granite surface had been fully cleaned of every last trace of the orange paint. The brass plaque gleamed with a polish considerably better maintained than it had been in the years before the vandalism even occurred, and the only remaining step before the memorial could be formally returned to its place at the center of the square was lifting the slab itself back onto the reinforced platform, a task requiring specialized lifting equipment that Daniel had already arranged to borrow from a chapter member's construction contact for the following Saturday. Daniel stood looking at the fully restored slab on that first Saturday of February, still lying flat on a protective tarp while it awaited its final lift, and felt something he had not entirely expected to feel at the start of this difficult and uncertain process back in October. A quiet and specific satisfaction that had little to do with the granite itself and a great deal to do with the 15-year-old boy standing a few feet away, examining his own polishing work on the brass plaque with the same careful, critical eye he had been bringing to this work for months. And Daniel understood, watching him, that whatever came next, the formal rededication ceremony Daniel was already beginning to plan, the question of what role, if any, the boys themselves should play in that public moment, the much harder question of what happened to this particular arrangement once Tyler's required hours technically ran out. All of it was going to require careful thought in the weeks ahead, but that the most important and most uncertain part of the entire experiment, whether genuine understanding could actually be reached at all, had already, somewhere across these cold winter Saturdays, been answered. The memorial was lifted back onto its reinforced platform on the second Saturday in February, the borrowed equipment making short work of what 4 boys alone could never have managed. And Daniel had deliberately invited Tyler, Connor, and Jace to be present for the lift itself, standing close enough to watch the slab settle back into place. The 4 names, once again upright and visible, the way they had stood for 46 years before a single October night had knocked them flat. Once the lift was complete and the mounting confirmed secure, Daniel turned to the question of the rededication, a small public ceremony to formally mark the memorial's restoration. And it was during the planning of that ceremony that the first real controversy of the entire process emerged, not from the police department or from any of the boys' families, but from a handful of Millbrook residents who had grown aware, through the slow, informal channels by which small towns learn most things, that the boys responsible for the original vandalism had been the same boys working alongside the chapter each Saturday morning, and who objected, sometimes quite forcefully, to the specific proposal Daniel brought to the chapter and then to a brief public meeting at the town hall, that Tyler in particular should stand among the chapter members during the rededication itself, not at the back of the gathered crowd as a quietly forgiven offender, but visibly present among the people who had done the restoration work, in recognition of the genuine role he had played in completing it. A woman named Pauline Granger, whose own father's name sat on a different town memorial 3 counties over, stood up at the town hall meeting and argued, with considerable and not entirely unreasonable heat, that placing the boy who had helped destroy this memorial in a position of visible honor at its rededication sent precisely the wrong message to every other teenager in Millbrook who might someday consider similar vandalism. That consequences existed for a reason, and that this arrangement, however well-intentioned, risked looking less like genuine accountability and more like a quiet reward for bad behavior dressed up in the language of redemption. Daniel stood and answered her directly in front of the gathered town hall crowd, choosing his words carefully because he understood this argument deserved a serious answer rather than a dismissive one. He told Pauline and the rest of the room that he understood the concern completely, that he had in fact shared a version of that same concern himself back in October before any of this began, uncertain whether genuine accountability could survive being paired with something that might look, from the outside, like leniency. But he told them that he had spent 4 months now watching this particular boy work, had watched him arrive early without being asked, had watched him spend an entire unrequested Saturday perfecting a single small brass plaque until it met a standard nobody had explicitly demanded of him, had watched him check library books out of the county system on his own initiative to learn about men he had never known existed before October, and that Daniel was not asking the town to forget what Tyler had done. He was asking the town to recognize what Tyler had actually become across the months since, and to understand that the specific kind of visible standing Daniel was proposing was not a reward for the original act of vandalism, but a recognition of the considerably harder and more important work the boy had done afterward, work that none of the town's standard processes would have required of him at all. The room remained divided after Daniel finished speaking, several residents nodding along with what he had said, several others still visibly unconvinced, and the matter was eventually settled not through any further argument, but through Chief Ortiz himself standing up near the end of the meeting, an intervention nobody had specifically requested of him, and telling the room plainly that he had personally observed this particular arrangement unfold across 4 months of unannounced visits, that he had gone into the process with exactly the same skepticism several people in this room were currently expressing, and that he was prepared to state publicly, in his professional capacity as the town's chief of police, that what he had witnessed in this specific case represented genuine and durable change of a kind his department's standard processes rarely, if ever, managed to produce, and that he personally supported Daniel's proposal regarding Tyler's role in the ceremony, though he added, for the sake of fairness and clarity, that this support was specific to what he had actually observed in this particular case, and was not, and should not be read as, a blanket endorsement of leniency for vandalism in general. This intervention, coming from the town's own chief of police rather than from Daniel or anyone connected to the chapter, shifted the room considerably, and the proposal passed without further formal objection, though Daniel understood, walking out of the town hall that evening, that Pauline Granger and several others remained genuinely unconvinced, their concerns not unreasonable simply because they had ultimately been overruled. And he made a private note to himself that the rededication ceremony itself was going to need to be handled with considerable care if it was going to actually demonstrate, rather than simply assert, the legitimacy of what this arrangement had produced. The ceremony took place on a clear, cold morning in late February, the entire town square filled with a crowd considerably larger than Daniel had expected, word of the unusual controversy having apparently drawn out residents who might not otherwise have attended a routine memorial rededication. The four names stood fully restored on the upright granite slab, the brass plaque gleaming in the morning light, and Daniel stood near the front of the gathered crowd alongside Walt and the other chapter members who had worked on the restoration, Tyler standing among them exactly as proposed, Connor and Jace present as well, though standing slightly further back, their own participation in the ceremony itself somewhat less central than Tyler's, given the considerably different trajectories their individual months of restitution had followed. Chief Ortiz spoke first, briefer and considerably more direct than Daniel had expected, telling the gathered crowd plainly that he had initially granted this unconventional arrangement back in October with real skepticism about whether it could succeed, and that he stood before them now, 4 months later, prepared to say that it had succeeded in ways his own department's standard processes had rarely managed across his 22 years as chief, and that he believed Millbrook had, through this specific case, learned something valuable about what genuine accountability could look like when given room to develop properly rather than processed quickly and forgotten. Daniel spoke next, briefly, about the 4 men whose names stood restored on the granite, about James Whitlock specifically, the friend he had carried with him for 54 years. And then, near the end of his remarks, he asked Tyler to step forward, not to speak, simply to perform one final small task in front of the gathered town, polishing the brass plaque one last time with the same careful technique he had spent months perfecting. A visible demonstration, rather than a verbal explanation, of exactly what these 4 months had actually produced. Tyler stepped forward from among the chapter members, his hands steady despite the considerable weight of the entire town watching him, knelt at the base of the memorial, and worked the polishing cloth across the brass in the same slow, careful circular motions Daniel had taught him back in December, the plaque catching the cold, clear morning light exactly the way it had on that quiet Saturday weeks earlier when nobody but Daniel and Walt had been watching, and the gathered crowd, Pauline Granger somewhere among them, watched this 15-year-old boy complete the work in total, focused silence. And whatever remaining doubt had lingered in the room before that moment seemed, in the specific quiet that followed, to settle, finally, into something considerably closer to acceptance. Spring arrived in Millbrook the way it usually arrived, slowly and then all at once, the bare trees around the square filling out across the final weeks of March, until the entire space looked by the second Saturday in April almost unrecognizable from the cold gray mornings of that previous winter. Tyler's formal restitution hours had technically concluded 6 weeks earlier, the agreement Daniel had originally negotiated with Chief Ortiz fulfilled and closed on the official record, the case formally resolved without charges, exactly as the unconventional arrangement had promised back in October. Connor and Jace had stopped coming to the square the moment their own required hours concluded, a fact Daniel had expected and did not hold against either of them, understanding that the arrangement had asked something genuine of both boys, and that both had given it in their own different ways, but that the deeper transformation Daniel had witnessed in Tyler specifically was never something he had expected to find universally across all 3 remaining boys. Connor had gone back to his ordinary teenage life, his father's hardware store, his friends, occasionally waving to Daniel from across the street with a politeness that suggested genuine, if moderate, gratitude, rather than any lasting connection to the work itself. Jace had stabilized considerably across the winter, his parents' separation finalized by spring in a way that seemed, paradoxically, to have settled something in him once the uncertainty resolved one way or another. And Daniel heard, through the same informal channels by which Millbrook generally circulated its news, that Jace had taken up running with the school's track team that spring. A development Daniel allowed himself a small private satisfaction in, even though it had little directly to do with the memorial itself. Tyler, however, kept showing up. He arrived on the first Saturday after his hours technically concluded, without anyone asking him to, walking across the square at 8 in the morning, exactly as he had every Saturday for the previous 5 months, and found Daniel and Walt already there, performing the small ongoing maintenance the memorial required even after its full restoration, clearing leaves from the base of the platform, checking the brass plaque for any early signs of tarnish. Daniel looked up when Tyler arrived and felt, for a brief moment, a flicker of concern that something had gone wrong, some new trouble bringing the boy back, before he registered that Tyler was simply standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets, the same nervous posture he had carried into this entire process back in October, except that what had once been shame now looked 6 months later considerably more like uncertainty about whether he was actually welcome to be there. Daniel asked him directly what brought him back. Tyler shrugged, the specific deflecting shrug of a teenager not yet fully comfortable naming what he actually wanted, and said only that he had nothing else to do on Saturday mornings anymore and figured he might as well help out if they needed it. Daniel, recognizing this answer for the careful understatement it almost certainly was, did not push further in that moment. He simply handed Tyler a spare set of work gloves and put him to work clearing the same leaves Daniel and Walt had already been clearing, and the three of them worked together through that entire morning in the same comfortable, largely silent rhythm that had developed across the previous months. Except that this time, for the first time, nothing was actually required of Tyler at all. He came back the following Saturday as well, and the one after that, and by the third week of April, Daniel decided the pattern had established itself clearly enough that the underlying question deserved to be asked directly rather than left to develop on its own indefinitely. He waited until Walt had stepped away to load some empty buckets into his truck, leaving Daniel and Tyler alone at the base of the memorial for a few minutes, and asked him plainly whether he wanted to keep doing this, not because anything required it of him anymore, but simply because he wanted to. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the granite rather than on Daniel, and when he finally answered, his voice carried none of the nervous deflection from the previous Saturday. He told Daniel that he had thought back in October that this was going to be the worst thing that had ever happened to him, getting caught, facing whatever consequence followed, and that he had spent the first several weeks simply trying to survive it without understanding much of anything beyond his own shame. But somewhere across the winter, he said, working alongside Daniel and Walt in the cold, learning the actual names and actual histories of the men whose memorial he had helped destroy, something had shifted in him that he still did not entirely have the words to explain, except that the work itself, the patient, careful, exacting work of restoring something that mattered, had become something he genuinely wanted to keep doing, independent of whatever consequence had originally brought him to it. He asked Daniel, directly and somewhat formally for a boy his age, whether he could stay on with the chapter's ongoing maintenance of the memorial permanently, not as part of any required arrangement, simply as something he did now, the way Daniel and Walt and the other members did it, because they cared about it and had decided on their own to keep caring about it indefinitely. Daniel told him yes, immediately and without hesitation, and felt accepting this unprompted request from a boy who had once stood at the edge of a platform with his hands in his pockets while three friends toppled a piece of granite that held more weight than any of them understood. Something close to the same quiet satisfaction he had felt back in February, watching Tyler polish the brass plaque in front of the entire gathered town. Except that this particular moment belonged to no audience at all, simply to the two of them, standing together at the base of a fully restored memorial on an ordinary Saturday morning that nobody beyond themselves would ever know to mark as significant. Walt, returning from the truck a few minutes later, found the two of them already back at work. Tyler clearing the last of the leaves from the base of the platform with the same careful attention he brought to everything connected to this particular piece of stone. And when Daniel told him quietly what had just been decided, Walt nodded without much visible surprise, having apparently expected this outcome for some weeks already, and reached almost reflexively for the worn photograph still kept behind his license, though this time he did not pull it out to show anyone. He simply touched the edge of his wallet through his jacket pocket, a small, private gesture, and went back to work. By early May, the chapter had commissioned a small weatherproof display case to be mounted on a low post beside the memorial itself, and inside it, framed and protected behind glass, Walt's photograph finally found a permanent place outside his own wallet for the first time in 55 years. 4 young men standing in front of a transport bus in 1970, grinning at whoever held the camera. 3 of their names now carved permanently into the restored granite a few feet away. The 4th man, who had lived to be 71 years old, standing now on the morning the case was finally mounted beside a 15-year-old boy who had spent the past 7 months learning every one of those 4 names by heart. Tyler knelt at the base of the memorial that same morning, the display case freshly installed beside him, and worked the polishing cloth across the brass plaque one more time. The same slow, careful, circular motion he had perfected back in December. The early May light catching the brass exactly the way it had caught it back in February, when the entire town had watched him do this for the first time. Nobody was watching this time except Daniel and Walt. The ceremony and the controversy and the careful public negotiation of the previous winter all long since settled into the quiet, ordinary rhythm of a thing that had simply become true, rather than something that needed continued proving. The 4 names on the granite caught the morning light the exact same way they had caught it for 46 years before. A single October night had knocked them flat, and Tyler Voss, 15 years old, who once stood at the edge of a platform with his hands in his pockets and let something terrible happen because he was more afraid of 3 friends' opinion than he was of the actual wrongness of what they were doing, knelt now in the spring grass beside the same memorial, polishing brass that did not need polishing nearly as badly as he polished it anyway, because the work itself, the patient and exacting and entirely voluntary work, had become, somewhere across these past 7 months, simply who he had decided he wanted to be. The plaque gleamed in the morning light. That was enough. 4 teenagers knocked over a war memorial on a dare, spray-painted the names of men who died defending this country, and ran into the dark thinking they had gotten away with something. They had not. And what happened next was not the easy kind of justice. A fine paid, a few hours logged, the whole thing forgotten within a year. A group of bikers, several of them carrying the names of fallen friends on that very stone, asked for something harder instead. Not punishment, understanding. Months of it. Cold Saturday mornings, careful hands on broken granite, an old photograph pulled out of a worn wallet at exactly the right moment. 3 of those boys did their time and walked away changed in small, ordinary ways. 1 of them never came back at all. And one boy, the youngest, the one who never even climbed onto that platform, kept showing up long after anyone required it of him. Because somewhere across those 7 months, scrubbing paint off a stranger's name, he learned something that no fine or court date ever could have taught him. That is what real accountability looks like, not a punishment that ends. A debt that gets paid in full, with your own 2 hands, until you understand exactly what you owed. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell us which part stayed with you the longest. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe so you are here for the next one. And if you know someone who needs to be reminded that real change takes patience, not punishment, send this to them today. We will see you in the next one.